So now we're going to look at the 5 marks of a strong church. And as I say, we're always dealing with this in combination with the 6 dimensions of persecution. Your persecutor will concoct a combination of these 6 Ds to take your church down, or you even. But where are the points of attack? So this is why we're coming on to this and asking about what's a strong church look like. And I'm going to argue that a strong church does basically 5 things well. 1, we teach Christians to know the truth of Jesus Christ. That's the teaching mark. 2nd, we enable Christians to live this truth out in the heart. That's formation. 3rd, we encourage Christians to share this truth with others outside the church. That's mission. 4th, we organize ourselves into a group so that we show the love of Christ in our community. That's fellowship. And then 5 is we take care to transmit the faith to the next generation. That's transmission. Now, in the world of thinking about what constitutes a strong church, there are 2 approaches. One is what we might call the quantitative approach, and it comes from the realm of church growth studies. You study a group of growing churches, you decide what's common, and you come up with a list of characteristics that seem to be in common, and you offer them as a kind of prescription for how to be a growing church. And there are some very well-known texts on this. Christian Swartz famously has 8 key principles in his book, Natural Church Development. And this is Swartz's 8: empowering leadership, gift-oriented ministry, passionate spirituality, functional structures, inspiring worship service, holistic small groups, need-oriented evangelism, loving relationships. Obviously, they're helpful, they're useful, they're quite aspirational. The big question, though, is whether they're not only descriptive, but prescriptive. If a church has those 8 characteristics, will it automatically then be a growing church? Is that some kind of law? So that's always the question with this approach. Are the characteristics descriptive of some church growth, or actually prescriptive of all church growth? And many have concluded that although they're quite useful as a template, it's just really description. So there is another approach to thinking about what constitutes a strong church. And that's much more relational and organic, and it seeks perhaps more consciously to be more rooted in Scripture rather than in sociology, although I'm not saying that the sociological has no biblical basis. The idea here is that the New Testament teaches that the Spirit blows where it wills when it comes to a strong church. Growth and multiplication are God's business. Our business is to act as faithful communities of witness to God's power and grace. Now, when we think in particular of persecuted contexts, it's quite common that churches do not grow under pressure, at least at first, when there's a special intensity. Chinese churches, for example, in the Cultural Revolution from 1966 to 1976, were not really growing numerically at all. They grew later in the 1980s when the Cultural Revolution was past. But during the time, though, of the Cultural Revolution, churches grew in a different way. They embedded into the family structure for the first time through the house church format. It wasn't numeric, it was organic. In fact, if one was to make the case that a growing church has to have 8 or 10 of those characteristics, persecuted churches would come across as rather disappointing. And it is interesting that of all the models of growing churches selected by the church growth gurus, few of them seem to come from studies done in persecuted countries. The prime examples of really growing churches seems to be based more on mega churches in cities in Latin America or the USA or some places in sub-Saharan Africa. But is the persecuted church such a disappointing story? Surely not, especially considering the revivals that have swept the likes of China and countries like Iran. It would seem to suggest that we limit a profile of church growth to mere numbers at our peril. So the more organic approach wants to look at the New Testament and extract the principles of what a strong, healthy church looks like. And there's some very famous literature in this area. Paul Manier has a book called Images of the Church in the New Testament, which is on your reading list. And he studies more than 100 different Greek words that provides 80 distinct images. John Driver focuses on what these images of the church tell us about mission. So he has pilgrimage images, like the way or new order. He has peoplehood images, like the people of God or the family of God. He has transformation images, such as salt, light, or a spiritual house. So from this approach, we're trying to figure out what the relational and spiritual characteristics of a strong church is. And of course, in our case, we're looking at it in a persecution setting. So this is just one way of thinking about it. There are others, and we'll link you to them. But I'm trying to say that you live out 5 essential characteristics as a Christian: knowing the love of Christ, living the love of Christ, sharing the love of Christ with others, showing the love of Christ in a group, and ensuring the love of Christ gets passed from one generation to another. And we've just specified them out like this because they're distinct targets of the persecutor. And it's helpful to think of it this way. Also, we use examples from Acts chapter 14, which is just a description of how Paul and Barnabas build strong churches in Lystra and Iconium and Antioch of Syria. It's only one approach to answering this question of what's a strong church. There are other good ones out there. But it is a bit unique in thinking of what are the 5 marks of a church in combination with the 6 dimensions of the enemy attack. And as you'll see from our diagram, all of the characteristics of a strong church are gathered around a heart shape. And this is to emphasize that in the faith, maturity is measured in the extent by which one nourishes and preserves a love relationship with Jesus Christ. Nothing less will do. Or at least it would be a terrible undershoot of what was available in Jesus. He is God that has come as an embodied person, and he describes his whole mission in terms of love. John chapter 15, remember, in the closed doors of the upper room, prior to those terrifying scenes of the trial and crucifixion, Jesus says, I have loved you, even as the Father has loved me. Remain in my love. When you obey my commandments, you remain in my love, just as I obey my Father's commandments and remain in his love. I have told you these things so that you will be filled with my joy. Yes, your joy will overflow. This is my commandment. Love each other in the same way I have loved you. John 15, 9 and 12, 9 to 12. And then John 13 is where we see Jesus saying, love one another in order that people will know that you are my disciples. So what really attracts people to the gospel is in fact the love Christians show to each other. And this should be intensified, of course, and on show every time you visit a church gathering. Recall, remember, what we learned from the great Chinese leader Wang Mingdao. Nothing is more important, he said, than the act of building ourselves a cell, a place where nothing else is allowed to happen except a focus on receiving and reflecting the love of Jesus. From that love, all our effectiveness in life and mission flows. For that reason then, it's the enemy's target.